This is the Mid-America PTTC podcast, where we believe prevention is better together, and together we are stronger. I'm your host, Steve Miller. This is episode 59, and in today's podcast, I have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Carolyn DuPont. She is Vice President of the Institute for Behavior and Health. The IBH mission is to reduce the use of illegal drugs. In her role as Vice President, she focuses on the areas of addiction treatment and prevention. She maintains a private practice specializing in anxiety and addiction. She was the founding president and principal investigator of DuPont Clinical Research, where she directed a team that conducted studies of investigational medication for the anxiety and affective disorders. She is a board certified by the American Board of Psychiatry and Neurology and by the American Board of Addiction Medicine. She is the co-author of numerous publications and several book chapters on anxiety and addiction. Before we get into the content, we would like to thank our funder, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. Quick note, although funded by SAMHSA, the content of this recording does not necessarily reflect the views of SAMHSA. We've got a lot of ground to cover, so let's get started. Well, welcome to the Mid-America's podcast, Dr. Carolyn DuPont. I'm very excited to have you here today.
Thank you. I was thrilled to get the invitation to be on this.
I want to know, what was it that enticed you to become a professional, a practitioner? What got you interested in this work?
Oh, thanks. That's a great question, and one that really has to make me pause a little bit. So I am a medical doctor. Obviously, I went to medical school, and in medical school, you go to circulate through all the different fields of medicine. And I considered, would I like to be primary care? Would I like to do pediatrics? I mean, what was it that really did I love? And what I found is that I loved psychiatry. I just loved it. I loved the stories that people had to tell. I loved getting to know people. And it turns out that the apple didn't fall very far from the tree. My father is a psychiatrist, and I grew up around the dinner table with him telling stories about his work, not like, Mrs. Smith did this or whatever, but like reviewing kind of interesting cases and concepts that had come up. And I was so fascinated. And I thought, how could you have a job that's this interesting, that's this important, that's this valuable? And so I really realized when I was in medical school that I was gravitating right back to psychiatry. And so I went into psychiatry, and I am a general adult psychiatrist. And most of my patients have anxiety or affective disorders. That's like depression and bipolar disorder. But one of the things when you're in practice for a while is you realize that no matter what area of medicine you are, even if I'd gone into one of those other fields, you see a lot of people with substance use disorders. And there's nothing that can derail a life like a substance use disorder. And I became, more and more involved in the substance use stuff. And again, that was another aha moment in the sense that my father not only was a psychiatrist, but also was the first director of the NIH National Institute on Drug Abuse, on NIDA, and he was the second White House drug czar. And so I grew up steeped in substance use disorders and in prevention. And when I went back to that as an adult, fairly far into my career, it was like coming home. I was like, yes, this topic is something that I'm extremely passionate about.
So it's a well-earned legacy is really kind of what it sounds like. I mean, your father is a pioneer in this field, and the work that you've done has also been remarkable. And we'll talk about any and all that we can get to. But I think the thing for our audience that I'd like to really explore to begin with is kind of that interrelation between anxiety or the other disorders that you mentioned, and maybe that correlation with early onset of using substances, kind of like,
Yes.
I'm medicating
Yes.
myself. And 9 times out of 10, this happens with a teenager and
Right.
Or adolescent. And so I kind of wondered if you could kind of speak to that interrelation between the disorder and then, the self-medication.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so important. I mean, one of the things that I say, which is seems a little flippant, but to have a risk of a mental health disorder or a substance use disorder, what you have to have is have a brain. In other words, all of us are at risk to have these disorders. And there are a lot of different factors, like there might be genetic things, or there might be environmental or trauma things that are going to make someone more likely to develop a disorder. But in fact, no one is safe. It's not like you can say, oh, I don't have any genetics for these disorders, and I don't have any trauma, therefore I'm safe. It doesn't work that way, unfortunately. The connection goes both ways also between mental health disorders and substance use disorders. There's an interesting study that showed that 30 to 45% of adolescents and young adults who were in care for a mental health disorder also had a co-occurring substance use disorder. So it's one of those things that, like, if someone comes in saying they have depression or anxiety, you really need to ask, what about that substance use? And then it goes the other way too. So people who come in, youth that come in with a substance use disorder as their primary issue, 65% or more of them have a co-occurring mental health disorder. And so these two things run so closely together that you almost never should be assuming I have just one. I need to look for both. And then on top of that is a little point you made. You mentioned that thing about self-medicating. And it's not a phrase I'm fond of, because it sounds like I'm taking this substance because it's going to make me feel better. And it can in the short run, but it invariably makes things worse. And I think that's really a hard lesson for people to learn. They think it's going to help. I'm feeling very anxious. And I think, for example, alcohol, which does have a natural anti-anxiety effect, is going to help. But what we know is that alcohol then has rebound anxiety, rebound insomnia. It has depression characteristics. And so there's really no problem that you have that alcohol and other substances can't make worse.
And I think that if you could speak to that, especially when we're talking about, let's say, I'll just pick a number, 14-year-old,
right?
And their developing mind. I mean, anxiety goes along with being an adolescent. Anybody that remembers being an adolescent can remember being anxious about that whole period in a life. But to introduce substances, whether that's drinking or smoking or the use of marijuana, has not only maybe it has that, like you said, short-term impact on the anxiety or the depression, but it has the potential for long-term consequences on brain development. And I don't think people really understand how significant that really can be.
This is such a great point, and it's something that really is different than maybe when you and I were kids. We didn't really understand that, and we didn't really understand how vulnerable the developing brain was to trauma of all types. And an example I give about this is concussion protocols. When we were growing up, we'd never heard that term, a concussion protocol. I mean, that wasn't like you might get knocked out or have a hard head hit in a sporting event, but no one kind of rushed in and said, here's the protocol we're going to do for this. And we've learned a lot over the years about how the trauma to the brain, even that appears to be fairly minor, but especially repeated trauma to that younger developing brain, really can have a big impact on that person, not just in the short run, but in the longer course of their life. And we now have imaging studies that show this beautifully. And I wonder if any of you have seen those studies that show the brain development from childhood through age 25, that it's continuing. So certainly a young brain has a lot more areas that are still developing, but a brain into that through the late teen years and early 20s still has significant areas that are developing. And that's really important when you think about substance use prevention, because you need to protect that uniquely vulnerable brain from the trauma of substance use. And that might sound like a kind of dramatic way to say it, the trauma of substance use. But if you look at people with substance use disorders, you will find that substance use disorder is generally a pediatric onset disease. That means that 90% of adults with a substance use disorder will have a history that they initiated that substance use before the age of 18. And for a lot of people, like a lot before 18, it's not unusual to hear someone 12, 13, 14 years old having their first experience with a substance. And the earlier and the heavier that use, the more likely it is to be correlated with bad outcomes. And whether that's a bad outcome of a substance use disorder or falling off their educational path, for example, not graduating from high school or not going on to college or not having success in their early career years. All of this is related to that early onset of a pediatric onset of a substance use disorder.
And I think you and I were talking about this before we actually pushed record, but I think that we as a society don't often see how this maybe plays out. And you just briefly touched on it, that maybe a person doesn't have a history. Maybe they have drank a few times in high school, but then they go away to college and they're in a different type of environment where it's a little bit more readily available. It's more, permissible. And then no one ever stops to think, well, that played a role in them possibly not getting that college education or not doing as well in their college career.
Absolutely.
All of those things don't really get recognized, I don't think. But when you, as you're illustrating this, it makes perfect sense that anything that's going in is having some kind of an impact on us, whether that's strictly education or whether that's, strictly substances. One or the other is going to impact that brain development at 15, 16, 17, up until, as I understand it, even into your mid, maybe even late 20s.
It is up to the mid and late 20s. And I love to say that to kids when I'm talking with them, because they love to know that they're going to get smarter, that their brain still has development to do. And so giving them that knowledge that your brain is still growing, and the lessons it's learning right now have a really positive, wonderful impact on their future. So be careful of that and protect that brain. And they get that. They like that concept.
I just want to throw this in here because I've always find it to be cute. Whenever I have this conversation, and I'm not an expert, but I will mention it in some of my presentations, and I always kind of illustrate that a girl's brain will develop a little faster than a boy's brain. The girls are always like, see, I told you I was smarter than you were. And I think that's just delightful because I think there's some truth to it, but I think that's fun to watch, especially when they're, I'm going to say the middle school age.
Sure.
They have a lot of fun with that.
I think people like to see that they're doing well. They like to play the comparison game and that sort of thing. And all of that can be inspiring, I think, when it comes to helping that individual make wise choices for their health. Like, you like being the smart one. Let's keep that going. Here's some of the things that you can do that will help you on your path and on your kind of mission. One of the things that you mentioned that I'm really involved in is what we call one choice prevention. And it's not a program, it's data that anybody who is working in prevention can use, and free of charge, and it's available and ready to share. And I will tell a little bit about that, but the punchline is it's all available on the One Choice Prevention website, and there's a toolkit you can actually download and use whatever it is you're working on. But what I like to show people is how the choices they make are important in terms of, again, their dreams, where they want to go. When you talk to a young kid, when you talk to an elementary school kid about substances, you don't have a hard time getting buy-in. They oh no, I would never smoke. That's yucky. I wouldn't drink. It's icky. Drugs are bad. They can completely buy into the health messages that they're given as children about that, which is fantastic. That's prevention messaging working really well. But you see a kind of gradual transition as they get older, and life gets complicated. Life gets complicated, and the parental messages or the adult messages can be complicated because adults maybe used when they were teens, for example, and they might think, oh, it's a normal part of growing up, and they may be more permissive because of their own personal experience. And we call it one choice because we've got this amazing research that shows that for many people, they really are making the choice to be the kind of person that chooses to use substances and the kind of person who chooses not to use substances. And it isn't really so much a matter of what substance it is. Is it alcohol? Is it marijuana in any of its forms? Is it nicotine in any of its forms? Or some other thing, any of the substances? It doesn't matter so much which of the things it is. It matters if they make that first decision, I'm going to try that, I'm going to use that. Because once you're someone who has made that choice to use, I'll use alcohol as an example, like I have chosen to use this in this one situation, all of a sudden it opens up all these options: when to use, what to use, how much to use, in what situations to use, and then what else to use. So what we have data to show is that all substance use is related. And once kids have made that choice to use one substance, their risk of using other substance way up, way up. But on the other hand, kids that make the choice not to use, kids who say, no, I don't do that, that's not for me, they are very unlikely to use any other substances. So when they say no to one thing, I'm saying no to alcohol at this party, that gives them an identity for themselves as what we call one choice. I've made this choice for myself. I'm someone that does not use.
That's interesting because as you're describing this, a completely different scenario went through my head. And it's almost like if you're going to take on the choice to be a safe driver, it's almost like we drive the speed limit, we wear a safety belt. I mean,
yes.
These things kind of play a role in that, but the choice is that I want to be a safe driver. And so it seems to me that with one choice prevention, you're really talking about this from the perspective is that it's holistic, or it's really a health issue.
It really is a health issue. And that's why we really think about it as a health standard. So when I'm really asked what is one choice, I say one choice is no use of any alcohol, nicotine, marijuana, or other drugs under the age of 18 for reasons of health. And that's a whole mouthful. And we list off all those things because if I just say to be drug-free, it can be confusing. Some people don't think alcohol is a drug. Some people don't think nicotine's a drug. Some people might be confused about what that age is that we're talking about. Are we talking about middle school students or high school students, or in our case, we're going all the way to 21, although that brain science will take you all the way to 25 in terms of that developing brain. But 21 is a good one because that's our law, and none of these substances are legal for people under the age of 21.
The other thing that I thought about, and I recently saw a presentation on your one choice, is that there's also this reality that one choice is not just something that's applicable like before I even start.
Yes.
One choice can be kind of, I'll use the term harm reduction. It can kind of be inserted into a person's life, even if they've had some experience with it. It's a way to maybe step back and see this as a way to reframe how I want to forecast my future.
This is really very important. And again, I always just go back to other health standard analogies that we're comfortable with. So one of them, for example, is to wear a seatbelt. And as you said, that's just part and parcel of kind of maybe being a good driver and making the decision that you're going to be a safe driver and to keep yourself safe. So you wear your seatbelt. And it isn't really a debate that most of us have with ourselves. We just wear our seatbelts. But if someone doesn't wear their seatbelt, it's not like they're excluded from the seatbelt club. So you didn't wear it yesterday, but you can make the choice to wear your seatbelt today. And you can make your choice after this to wear your seatbelt. And often you'll see things like that, like something will scare someone, like they didn't have their seatbelt on. Maybe they were in a crowded car with friends and something happened that scared them. And they're like, whoa, that was scary. I don't ever want to do that again. And it reinvests that concept of, you know what, I'm someone that wears my seatbelt. When you look at substance use, we have this amazing national data. It's from Monitoring the Future. And that data is usually used, that's big national collected from everybody data, decade to decade, year to year. And that's usually used to show how many high school students, for example, are using something, like what percentage of high school students drink alcohol or what percentage of them are smoking marijuana. And we at the Institute for Behavior and Health wondered if the data could ask a different question. And so we looked at that same national data and looked at how many high school seniors had not used any substances. And so we first asked how many have never used in their lifetime. So these are people that always wear their seatbelt. These are people that always choose not to use drugs. And again, alcohol, cigarettes, marijuana, or other drugs, like nothing. And what we found is back in the time that the data was first being collected, which was the late 70s and early 80s, that number was only about 2.9% of high school seniors had never used any of those substances in their lifetime. So basically, when I talk to parents, doctors, administrators, teachers, a lot of them, that's their life experience. And so when they'll say like, oh, it's a normal part of growing up, everybody does it, I'm always like, yeah, when did you go to high school? Because it was back in the 80s and early 90s, it was like that. But now that line, if you could see it, it's coming up in this amazingly consistent increase. And now it's 31.4% of high school seniors have never in their lifetime used anything. I mean, that's almost a third of high school seniors who have never used any of these substances. That's huge. But my favorite one is going to your point, and that says we looked at that same kind of question, but we asked, what about in the past month? And the reason that's so important is because I don't want it to be a purity test. Again, you didn't wear your seatbelt yesterday. Please choose to wear it today. Make smart choices. Great. So past month use, non-use, past month non-use allows for someone who might have used at some point in their life, but then is making a different choice for themselves. And what you see again in the 70s and 80s, that number was around 16%. So 16% that I didn't use in the past month. So we know that the vast majority of them were using frequently enough to be caught on a survey with the yes, I used in the past month. And now that number is 59%. So this was 2019 data is our most recent data. And it showed almost 60% of high school seniors have not used any of these substances in the past month. That means 60% of high school seniors are generally making smart choices for their health and protecting their brain health. And that is so exciting. That's really good news. And nobody talks about that. Everybody still is stuck with teenagers today. You know how teenagers are. Everybody does it. It's just a normal rite of passage. But that's not the reality. The reality is teens today are making smarter choices about their health than previous generations. And there are a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons is because of really strong prevention messaging that has now been going on in the schools and in our society for the past several decades.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Here I am working prevention, and I had not seen that kind of data reflection of that steep curve, if you will. Mm-hmm. That yeah. I knew fewer teens were using substances now than when I was a teen, and I know that from experience and from professional work as well. But it does beg that prevention is working in some regards. But do you think teens and being a part of that peer set also plays a role in that success? Meaning, I think that teens are a lot more empowered or more insightful because of the world that we live in and the
Yeah.
immediacy of things like social media. Do you think that they're kind of growing out of this in a way because it's their world? I mean, I'm going to give prevention some credit in that, but do you think the teens really empower one another to have a different outcome?
Yeah, I really do think that's true. And as it's getting to be more of a majority of people, so essentially a third, 30% who haven't used any in their lifetime, and 60% who haven't used in the past month, that becomes like a credible voice. And I think before this, and one of the things that parents often worry about is if I tell my child they can't use, they're going to be social outcasts. They have kind of a version of life that they think that those must be somehow not the cool kids. But actually, the statistics show us, look, it is a lot of the cool kids too. And so by identifying this, we give these people an opportunity to share and to amplify that voice that's already there, as you're kind of suggesting. It's already there without us pointing it out. It was already happening. And so they are beginning to share with each other what their life goals are. I also think this generation, this Gen Z generation, I mean, they're awesome. They're so great. Anybody who works with the kids knows this generation is amazing. And they're so socially aware. They're really aware of kind of the bad things in the world, and they want to make a difference. They want to impact the world and make it really a better place. And they're also really aware of their health and their mental health in a way that I just think previous generations had no idea about. Previous generations didn't talk about their mental health the way this generation will talk about it. And that connection between substance use and mental health disorders, it is there for people to figure out on many different fronts. And a lot of people, smart kids, they figure it out, and they are protecting their mental health by not using.
So one of the things that I'm also aware of that you spend time talking about, and of course, why we're here today, we primarily want to focus on that prevention amongst the adolescent during that adolescent experience. But I also know that you spend a lot of time talking about just kind of the basics of how to have good mental health. And so not only is this something that I'd like for you to share and frame it from the aspect that if you're a parent, this is something you should be teaching your kids, but again, it's applicable to an older person like me who didn't really grow up with the same framework. You've illustrated this. It was different when I was a teen than it is today. And I think, though, that speaking to those basics is really, I mean, it's almost like I look at them and I think my grandmother probably would have said exactly the same thing. But there's a lot of truth and maybe even some science to those.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely. So I have a kind of thing I developed just talking with my own patients about. And then I realized that this is just wellness care for everyone. These are the basics. That's why I call it back to basics for your own personal wellness. And so there are 6 points to it. The first one is sleep. Sleep is the foundation for all of us. And if you don't get a good night's sleep, it's really hard to manage with whatever life throws at you, whether that is social issues or academic issues or trauma, mental health issues, substance use. If you're not sleeping, it's really hard to cope. And so when you look at most of us, we should be getting 7 to 9 hours of good quality sleep a night. And then, because I'm always get back to talking about my youth really should be getting more sleep. They should be getting more like 8 to 10 hours of sleep in order to really be rested and ready for the day, ready to learn, ready to fully participate in their life. And so anything that interferes with the sleep is going to be a potential problem. The second thing is food. And food can be a problem on a number of fronts if you don't really think about it as fuel. And I want to think about food as fuel for our brains. It can be obviously fuel for our bodies as well, and if you're an athlete and that sort of thing. But for all of us, we need to make sure that the food that we're eating is giving our brain the healthy building blocks it needs to thrive. And one of the things that happens when we're not doing well is we often start eating less healthy foods. We might eat more processed foods or more sugars for that quick kind of burst that you can get from carbohydrates, simple carbohydrates like sugar or starches or things like that. And so really focusing on how's your eating. Are you doing the right thing by your eating? The third thing is exercise. We all need to exercise. This is another one of those health standards. Everybody knows it. Exercise is important to be healthy. That doesn't mean everybody does it. It's hard to build it into your life. It's hard to be consistent. But if you're not doing well, it's a thing to really focus on and say, what am I doing to exercise? And, can I get that up to at least 30 minutes, at least 4 times a week of whatever it is that I choose to do as my exercise? And don't set that bar too hard to begin with. So don't say I have to go running 30 minutes a day. It could be walking. Let's start with walking. Let's work on the routine of it before we push ourselves to do something that's really hard. But building it in as, again, part of our total wellness. The next thing is time outside. And I can't state this enough. We do better when we have time outside. And the pandemic, you and I were talking before this a little bit also about how the pandemic affected us, much less other people that we work with. And one of the things is that a lot of us stayed at home, and that meant literally inside. And that turns out to be just bad for us in general. We need to be outside. We need to be out in the sunshine, which is great, but actually outside in pretty much any weather, not if it's a tornado, but almost any weather is good. Wear the appropriate clothing and get out there and enjoy it, and enjoy those different seasons. Identify it's spring and I can smell the moist earth, or it's fall and I can begin to feel the crispness of the air, or see that changing in the angle of the light, or whatever it is I'm observing around me. That's good for our mental wellness. The fifth thing is positive content. And this is an interesting one because it's in contrast to negative content. And negative content, it turns out to be, unfortunately, really easy to find. The news is usually negative content. A lot of times our peer groups are very negative. They're going to talk about negative things that are happening, maybe being very cynical, maybe being kind of snarky, maybe being alarmed by the political climate, whatever's happening. Can be a lot of negative content. So I really ask again, when you're taking care of your wellness, take stock of what are you balancing that with in terms of positive content. It could be music you're listening to, it could be podcasts that you're listening to, or books that you're reading, or people that you're with. But let's make sure that you're feeding your mind some positive things to balance out all that negative stuff that's coming in. And that's going to really help your brain kind of look for a brighter day. And the more you look for positives, the more you find them. But unfortunately, most of us do the opposite naturally. The more we look for negatives, the more we find them. So let's kind of retrain your brain to do that. And then the last one is right back to our topic here, and that's check your substance use. And substance use can really sneak in there, sometimes pretending initially to be something that you're doing as a positive thing, like a reward at the end of the day, maybe having a glass of wine or something like that at the end of the day, or a cigarette to calm you down if you're a smoker. And it can kind of look a little bit like it's helpful. But in fact, what we've learned through a lot of research is there is no problem that you have that substance use can't make worse. And so your substance use is something you really want to curtail and stop completely if you can, especially when you're focusing on your wellness. And if we're talking about youth, remember, none of these substances are legal under the age of 21, and none of them are good for the developing brain. So they absolutely should be attended to right away. So that's kind of my fast, if you're struggling, whoever you are, at any age, any stage, any life situation, sit down and ask yourself those 6 things: sleep, food, exercise, time outside, positive content, and substance use. And really check in with yourself, be very honest, and then pick where you can make a difference in your life with one of those things. And I think you're going to find it helps.
Well, that would be a note to end on right there. But we've covered a lot of ground, and I was sitting here thinking, boy, this would be could be an ongoing conversation. We could come back and pick a different angle from this same kind of subject matter at another time. But is there something that maybe you would have liked to approach that we didn't get to, or more importantly, is there something that you would like the audience to really know, or maybe even do? After they've heard this podcast?
Thank you. I will. So this has been fantastic. It's been so fun to cover all of these different topics, but you're right. I feel like almost each of these topics could be their whole own thing. And that would be fun. But what I really want to say is the 3 points I want to take home about what one choice is are 3 really important points. One is that brain is continuing to develop through the mid-20s, and protecting it is very important. And that is including protecting it from substance use to exposure at any level. The second part is that all substance use is related. So if someone makes a choice to use one drug, for example, alcohol, their risk of using other substances, marijuana, nicotine, or any other opioids or any other stimulants, it goes way up. And that's true whatever the first drug is. So if that first person, the first thing the person is exposed to is nicotine, it's the same. That increased their risks of those other substances. Where their first introductory thing is a marijuana, their risk of drinking and heavy drinking goes way up. Their risk of using other types of drugs goes way up. And so it really boils down to one choice: to be the kind of person that uses or the kind of person that doesn't use. And for health, we really want to give people that data that shows that it really is important, the choices that you're making to protect your brain. And then the last part is that this is really already happening, that there's a growing number of youth that are choosing not to use, that have never used in their lifetime, or that have not used in the past month, and are really focusing on their health and their wellness. And it's our job as adults to support them and encourage them and help them continue or to get back onto a path of making healthy choices for themselves. And so those are really the key things. If you are interested in the things that I'm talking about, our website, onechoiceprevention.org, has all this information on it for you to use in any way you want. But it also has a toolkit that's specifically developed for anybody who works in youth prevention or wellness, youth wellness in any way, that you can actually download handouts that you can give, or slides that you can use. And we can personalize that with your organization's information on it. So if you're doing a wellness fair at your school or in your community, you can use that stuff and have it personalized to your stuff. And that's all completely free of charge. We're trying to get this information into the people's hands who are doing the hard work, because people working in prevention are rock stars and we want to help them out.
Wow. Yeah, this has been a great conversation. Like I think I said in the onset, I knew we wanted to talk about One Choice, but then as I learned more about your professional background, I'm so glad that we were able to even discuss some of the interrelation between some of the disorders and maybe the onset of substance use, because I just don't think that we as a public really understand the significance behind just that simple concept right there, that
absolutely,
this can be very complicated for somebody that's experiencing the growth that we all do during that adolescent period, and it has lifelong consequences if we're not aware of it, or if not for all, for many.
Right. Absolutely. And I think that if not for all, but for many, is really important, because there's not like, oh, if you have 5 concussions, you now have a traumatic brain injury. We know that. And you could not wear your seatbelt many times and not be in a life-threatening car accident. So I don't want to overstate, like you've immediately damaged your brain if you've used that. You lose credibility if you say something like that, because that's not people's life experience. They can see peers and things that have used and are clearly doing well. The problem is that you don't know. And there are a lot of people who aren't doing well. And so I always ask adults who are kind of skeptical about this because they're like, well, I used as a teen and I'm okay. Think about some of your classmates and your peers. Are they all okay? Because some of them aren't. And that's what we're trying to prevent.
That's a good point. That's a good place to end. And I want to say thank you once again. This has been delightful. I hope you will come back at some point. And I'm sure we'll find out a way to approach this topic in a new and inventive way. But the invitation's there if you'd like to come back sometime.
Wonderful. I'd love it.
And thank you for listening to this Mid-America PTTC podcast. To learn more about any upcoming trainings, visit pttcnetwork.org and look under your PTTC for the Mid-America link. Remember, prevention is better together, and together we are stronger.